It started with a scream. Not a human scream, but a deep, strained cry echoing through the flooded reeds of the Everglades. Thomas Blake, a park ranger with tired eyes and a steady hand, was making his final patrol of the day when he heard it. The kind of sound that cuts through the wind and sits in your bones. And what he found next would change his life, and a hippo's, forever. Before we begin, take a second to drop a comment. Let us know where in the world you're listening from. Your stories help ours travel farther. The skies above Everglades City, Florida, were still thick with the remnants of a passing storm. Low-hanging clouds hovered like ghostly blankets, and the air smelled of wet earth and cypress. Water still dripped from the fronds of the saw palmettos, and shallow pools along the trail glistened with the reflection of a sun that hadn't quite pierced the mist. The Everglades, in all its mystery, had never looked more ancient, more watchful. Thomas Blake guided his mud-streaked patrol ATV through a flooded dirt path that coiled through the heart of the reserve. 42 years old, Thomas had the quiet demeanor of someone who had spent much of his life listening more than speaking. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a wiry beard peppered with gray and blue eyes that carried the weight of too many stories left untold. Raised in central Georgia by a father who rarely smiled and a mother who died too young, Thomas had grown up believing that nature was the only place where silence didn't feel lonely. After serving in the Army as a combat medic, he returned stateside and dedicated his life to conservation, trading deserts, and deployments for wetlands and wildlife. The tires of his vehicle sloshed gently as he slowed at the edge of a flooded marsh. It was supposed to be a routine final sweep before sunset, but the sound that reached him through the fog halted everything. It was a cry deep, guttural, and aching. Not a bird, not a gator. Something else entirely. He turned off the engine and listened. Again the cry rang out, like the strained moan of something massive and in pain. He stepped out into ankle-deep water, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. Rifle slung behind his back, not drawn. He walked carefully, hand resting near the tranquilizer pouch clipped to his vest. Visibility was low, but the call led him true. As he rounded a bend in the brush, his breath caught. There, in the clearing ahead, was a young hippopotamus, maybe 3 years old. Still small by hippo standards, but already the size of a refrigerator. Its left hind leg was caught in a massive steel trap, the kind outlaw poachers used to snare deer or boar, now clamped around raw, bloodied flesh. The creature's flank rose and fell rapidly, eyes wild with fear and pain. Mud and blood mixed into a sickening paste beneath it. But what truly froze Thomas wasn't the wounded calf. It was the presence of 4 fully grown hippos just beyond the clearing, half submerged in the marsh water. They weren't making a sound. They weren't charging. They weren't fleeing. They were watching. One of them, a massive female with flared nostrils and bloodshot eyes, had her head tilted ever so slightly to the side. Her ears flicked once. Thomas felt it instinctively. She was the mother, and she was grieving. Hippos were notoriously aggressive, especially when protecting their young. Stories of overturned boats and crushed crocodiles weren't exaggerations. If she chose to rush him now, he wouldn't have a second to react. Yet she didn't move. None of them did. Thomas weighed his options. He could back away, return to his vehicle, radio the station, and bring back a team. That would take over an hour. In that time, the calf could bleed out or worse. The poachers could return. He glanced back at the trap, noticing the rusted hinges, the thick chain nailed into a stump. The trap was old but brutal. It had no place in these wetlands. He took a breath and stepped forward, slowly, keeping his posture low and non-threatening. He murmured as he walked, not because the hippos would understand, but because the sound of his own voice anchored him. "Easy now, sweetheart. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to help." The hippo calf's eyes locked with his. Its body trembled. A thin line of foam clung to the corners of its mouth. Thomas crouched beside it, careful not to make sudden movements. "Up close," The injury was worse. The flesh beneath the clamp was turning purple, and pus was starting to ooze from where the metal had torn skin. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a foldable metal rod. Using it as leverage, he inserted it into the jaws of the trap, then slowly began to pry it open. His muscles strained. The trap groaned. Sweat poured from his brow, stinging his eyes. At one point, the trap snapped partially shut again, nearly catching his knuckles. He gritted his teeth and tried again. Behind him, the mother hippo snorted once, loud and sudden. Thomas froze. The calf whimpered, then silence. The mother remained where she was. The moment passed. After minutes that felt like hours, the clamp gave way with a sharp, metallic pop. The young hippo flinched but didn't cry out. Thomas gently pulled the bloodied leg free, then sprayed antiseptic from his kit, wincing as the calf twitched from the sting. With practiced speed, he wrapped a loose gauze bandage around the worst of the wound. It wasn't perfect, but it would do for now. He leaned back on his heels and exhaled, finally looking toward the adults again. All four were still staring. The mother had stepped slightly closer, her eyes unreadable. Thomas didn't know if what he saw was suspicion, confusion, or something else entirely. Without turning his back, he rose slowly, collected his tools, and began to step away, murmuring softly. No rush, no threat. The wind rustled the sawgrass. Frogs croaked in the distance. Then, just as he reached the edge of the clearing, he turned for one last look. The young hippo was lying still, breathing more calmly. The mother had stepped forward and now stood beside her calf. Her gaze lingered on Thomas for a heartbeat longer. Then she lowered her head and gently nuzzled her child. And Thomas knew he had made the right call. The sky was beginning to shift from gray to gold, the mist parting like a curtain revealing the soft fire of a Florida sunset. Thomas Blake drove slowly down the marsh trail, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Though he was safe, his heartbeat hadn't returned to normal since the encounter an hour earlier. The image of the injured young hippo, lying helplessly in the trap, replayed in his mind like a haunting photograph. Even more powerful was the gaze of the mother, the way her wide, scarred face had held back violence in favor of silent watching. That look stayed with him. It wasn't animalistic, it was something else. Something frighteningly close to human. As he approached the ranger station, a squat, single-story outpost near the edge of the Everglades, she saw the familiar figure of Lana Whitaker stepping out to meet him. Lana, 39, was Thomas's closest colleague and the assistant wildlife coordinator for the region. She was a petite woman with tightly tied auburn hair, deep-set brown eyes, and a sharp mind known for logging every poaching incident and patrol pattern in color-coded detail. Lana was ex-military too, formerly a Navy intelligence officer who had turned to conservation work after the death of her brother, also a ranger 5 years earlier. The loss had hardened her edges but sharpened her focus, making her someone Thomas both respected and relied on. "You look like hell," she said without smiling, wiping her hands on her cargo pants. "You weren't answering the radio." Thomas stepped out, mud-streaked and sweat-soaked, and gave a short nod. "Found a poacher's trap. Hippo calf caught in it." Lana's eyes widened. "Alive?" "Barely. Took the trap off. Bandaged what I could. Didn't use the tranquilizer. The mother was there. Whole herd, actually. Just watching." Lana stared at him for a long second. "And they didn't charge?" "Number. Not once." She exhaled and motioned for him to follow her inside. "We need to log this, and you need water." Inside the ranger station, the air was cooler, the walls covered with maps, pinned sightings, and laminated safety protocols. Thomas sat down, wiping the sweat from his neck with a damp towel, as Lana opened her laptop. "You're sure it wasn't a snare?" "Steel, jawed trap. Looked old, rusted, probably laid days ago for hogs or deer." "Idiots," she muttered. "You said the calf was maybe 3 years old?" "Yeah, limping hard, deep tissue damage. I don't know if it'll make it, but it was aware. knew I wasn't trying to hurt it. Lana stopped typing. Do you think they'll stay near? I don't know. But the look on the mother's face when I touched her calfet wasn't fear, it was restraint. Neither of them spoke for a while. The hum of the old ceiling fan creaked rhythmically, the sound filling in for the heavy silence. Then Lana stood. I'll notify Fish and Wildlife, and we'll do a sweep tomorrow morning for more traps. You get some sleep. Thomas nodded, but he knew sleep wouldn't come. That night, lying in his small cinder-block cabin not far from the station, he dreamt not of danger, but of a wide pair of eyes staring at him through reeds, unblinking. When he woke before dawn, covered in a sheen of sweat despite the cool air, he knew he had to return. The morning light filtered in soft ribbons through the mossy trees. By the time Thomas reached the swamp clearing where he had freed the calf, the mist was lifting. He parked further back this time and approached on foot. The air buzzed with insects and the distant caws of water birds. To his surprise, the clearing was empty. No hippos. No blood. Just flattened reeds and the broken trap he had discarded near the stump. He crouched, inspected the ground-fresh mud tracks. They had left, but not long ago, likely during the night. He felt something settle in his chest, disappointment, but also relief. They were moving, surviving. That mattered. As he turned to leave, he heard it, a low grunt. He pivoted slowly. Just beyond the clearing, in the shallow water, stood the mother hippo, alone this time, partially submerged, her massive head visible above the surface. Her gaze met his. No threat. No aggression. She didn't approach. She didn't flee. She simply stayed watching. Thomas raised a hand slightly. It's okay, he said softly, unsure why he spoke at all. I won't come closer. They held that silent connection for what felt like an eternity. Then, without splash or sound, she turned and disappeared into the reeds. He stood there a moment longer, listening to the breeze and the grass. Then he walked away. The morning fog returned to Everglades City 2 days later, curling like breath across the marshes as Thomas Blake drove his patrol vehicle through the winding waterlogged trail. The air was cool and still, thick with moisture, and every passing bird call echoed clearer than usual through the quiet. The swamp looked different today, not more dangerous, just more alive. Thomas sat a little straighter behind the wheel, his eyes sweeping the reeds with more than professional curiosity. Since the rescue, something in him had shifted less procedural, more instinctual. He wasn't just monitoring the reserve anymore. He was being watched too, and this time, it didn't feel like a threat. As he rounded a bend near a wide stretch of floodplain, his gaze caught a subtle movement along the water's edge. Standing partially submerged at the far end was the same female hippo, the mother. She stood unmoving, her massive body half shielded by tall grasses, her eyes locked on the approaching jeep. Thomas slowed the vehicle but didn't stop. She made no move to approach. Her gaze followed him like a silent sentinel. He passed by without speaking a word, the air between them charged with something that needed no explanation. When he glanced into the rearview mirror, she was still there, watching until the trees swallowed her from view. That night, in his small cabin, lined with faded wildlife posters and a rusted ceiling fan that clicked softly overhead, Thomas spoke to someone who rarely heard about the darker parts of his work, his daughter, Emily. Emily Blake was 10 years old, a quiet child with her mother's warm brown eyes and her father's watchful calm. She lived with her mother Thomas's ex-wife, Jennifer Naples, about 2 hours away. They had joint custody, though Emily spent most holidays and summers in the Glades with Thomas. Since the divorce 3 years ago, they had grown closer not by shared routines, but by shared silences. Emily was a budding artist, always carrying a sketchbook with pages of animals, some real, others imagined, always drawn with heart. Their call connected through static, and Emily's voice came through, light and cheerful. "Hi, Dad. Did you find any new nests today?" "No nests," Thomas said with a soft chuckle. "But I think I made a friend." Emily gasped. "Another ranger?" "A hippo." There was silence, then a giggle. "A hippo friend? Did it give you a hug?" Thomas told her everything in soft, simple words. About the trap, the mother who didn't attack, and how he kept seeing her always just far enough away to leave him wondering if it was real. Emily, as he expected, was enthralled. She asked for details: what the hippo's eyes looked like, how the calf reacted, what the swamp smelled like. And then she said, "Can I draw her?" "Of course," he said, smiling, picturing her already flipping open that dog-eared sketch pad. "Just make her look brave." The next morning, Thomas found a folded piece of printer paper tucked into his locker at the station. It was addressed in crayon, "For Dad, from your hippo guardian." The drawing showed a large, strong hippo standing in front of a tiny stick-figure man with a ranger hat. Above them, little hearts floated in the air, and a speech bubble read, "Don't worry, I've got your back." Lana passed by as he unfolded it, peering over his shoulder. "New mascot?" Thomas didn't respond directly. He just said, "She's been following me." Lana raised an eyebrow. "The hippo?" "Twice now, same place. She doesn't get close, just watches." Lana didn't scoff. She knew better than to dismiss wildlife intuition. Maybe she's making sure you don't fall into a trap yourself. Later that week, it happened again. Thomas was doing a perimeter sweep around dawn, the sun still a thin line of orange across the horizon, when his headlights caught something large and unmoving in the reeds. This time, it wasn't just the mother. The entire group of hippos was there. 4 adults, including her, and one smaller figure, the calf, now walking with a pronounced limp, but walking nonetheless. They weren't blocking the trail. They weren't grazing. They weren't even clustered together. They were lined up, almost evenly spaced, along the edge of the shallow creek, like statues, waiting for something to pass. Thomas slowed the jeep, heart thudding not with fear, but awe. As he drove by, not one of them moved. Not one broke the line. He counted them aloud under his breath, like a strange kind of roll call. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Something about it felt ceremonial, unspoken. When he glanced in his side mirror a minute later, the line had dissolved into movement. They were retreating into the fog, water rippling behind them, but the message lingered. Back at the station, he tacked Emily's drawing to the bulletin board beside the map of poaching hotspots. The caption below now read, in Lana's handwriting, "Official Marsh Security Team, do not cross." The Everglades wore storms like a second skin, the kind that didn't knock politely, but kicked the door in and soaked everything it touched. By late afternoon, the sky had gone dark, the kind of sickly gray that made even seasoned rangers like Thomas Blake keep one hand on the emergency radio. Wind howled through the cypress knees, and water rushed through the already flooded trails, turning lowlands into rivers and paths into swamps. It wasn't the first time a summer storm had carved through the Everglades with violent beauty, but this one felt different, more urgent, more unpredictable. Thomas had been out since dawn, running flood response alongside another ranger named Caleb Morrison, a 29-year-old Florida native with sun-blonde hair, freckled skin, and the boyish enthusiasm of someone still romanticizing wilderness work. Caleb was quick on his feet and quicker with a joke, though underneath his charm lay a genuine care for the land that reminded Thomas of himself 20 years earlier. They'd just finished checking on a flooded nesting site when the call came in, an emergency signal from a group of birdwatchers stranded near Snakebite. Caleb went to assist. Thomas, soaked through and coated in mud, headed back alone toward the ranger station along the longest route, Loop Trail 3, the same trail that had become strangely familiar to him ever since that day with the trap. The rain intensified, slashing sideways across the windshield. The wipers worked in frantic rhythm. Thomas squinted into the wall of water ahead, every instinct telling him to get off the trail before the marsh claimed it. But just as he prepared to veer off, his eyes caught movement ahead, large, slow, and unmistakably out of place. A shape stood still on the waterlogged trail. A young hippo, its gray-pink skin slick with rain, its ears twitching every few seconds. Its left hind leg still bore a faint outline of the wound, but it was healed now, barely a scar beneath the mud. Thomas brought the Jeep to a crawl. The calf didn't flee. It stood like it had been waiting. He turned off the engine. For a long moment, the storm drowned everything in sound. Then he opened the door. The rain hit him like a curtain, but he stepped out slowly, raising one hand. "Hey," he called softly, his voice nearly lost in the roar. "What are you doing out here?" The young hippo blinked, then shifted its weight forward. Its massive body moved with purpose, cautious, but without fear. It stepped through a shallow pool, stopping only a few yards from him. Then it did something Thomas would never forget. It wiggled its ears, snorted gently, and let out a soft, almost curious grunt. It remembered. Thomas stood frozen, water dripping from his cap. His breath caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. "You really do remember, don't you?" he said, his voice cracking a little. "You stubborn, beautiful thing." He took a single step forward, but stopped when a new sound broke through the rain, a deeper grunt from the trees. He turned. Emerging from the mist was the mother hippo, larger than he remembered, her bulk half shrouded by the curtain of water. But there was no aggression in her gait. She moved slowly, placing herself between the trees and her calf. Her eyes found Thomas's and held them. Time didn't feel real in that moment. Only the rain and the wind and 3 lives caught in the strange stillness of recognition. Thomas didn't move. He didn't need to. The calf gave another soft grunt and turned toward its mother. The two stood side by side, now one healed, one watchful. The mother blinked once, a long, deliberate blink, and then turned away. The calf followed, casting one last glance at Thomas before disappearing into the shrouded underbrush. He stood in the rain long after they were gone, his boots filled with water. His fingers went numb, but he didn't feel the storm anymore. When he returned to the station late that night, Lana was there, towel drying her hair and sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. "Thought the swamp swallowed you," she said dryly. Thomas just hung his soaked jacket on the wall hook. "Saw them again, the calf and the mother." Lana blinked, her demeanor softening. "Yeah? They came to me this time." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "What did they do?" Thomas looked at his mud-streaked boots, his voice quieter than usual. "They left, but they let me see them first." She nodded slowly, then handed him the thermos. "Sounds like a gift to me." He took it with a tired smile. "Yeah, I think it was." The sun dipped low over the Everglades, casting golden streaks across the shallow waters and long shadows through the reeds. It was late autumn now, and though Florida didn't know snow, the air had a crispness that hinted at seasons turning. Thomas Blake sat alone on the edge of a quiet marsh overlook, sipping coffee from a metal thermos Emily had painted with tiny hippos and hearts. The thermos was a little scratched now, the paint faded in spots, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. Next to him, tucked safely inside a weatherproof clipboard, was a laminated version of the drawing Emily had given him months ago, Dad and his hippo guardian. It had traveled with him through every patrol, stuffed into bags, pinned to tents, even shown to school children during conservation workshops. It had become more than a keepsake. It was part of his story now. The Education Center at the Everglades Preserve, a modest wood frame building nestled near the visitor trailhead, had recently added a new weekend program, Rangers and Wild Bonds, a talk given by Thomas every other Saturday to families, wildlife interns, and curious tourists. It wasn't something he'd ever expected to do. Public speaking had never been his strength. But Lana, persistent as always, had talked him into it. "People don't need another slide about wetlands," she told him. "They need stories that make them care." So Thomas told the story, each time a little differently, depending on the audience. Sometimes he emphasized the science, the behavior of hippos, the rarity of human interaction. Other times, especially when Emily was present, he leaned into the wonder, the quietness of the mother, the cautious return. the line of hippos in the mist. And always, always he finished with the same line, "Some connections don't need words to last forever." Today, the visitor center had been full. A local middle school had brought students for a field day, and Thomas had stood beside his usual slideshow, reading from a weathered field journal as he pointed to photos of the Everglades. When he pulled out the drawing and told them about the trap, the calf, and that first moment the mother didn't attack, the room fell silent. Afterwards, a girl with braces and frizzy curls came up to him and asked, "Do you think the hippo knew you were trying to help?" Thomas knelt to her level and said, "I think she knew I didn't run." Now, back at the marsh overlook, he watched the last rays of light drift across the swamp. Dragonflies hovered. Egrets glided low over the water. The world was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of insects and the wind stirring the grasses. And then he saw it. At first, it was only a shape, a dark bulk among the reeds. He narrowed his eyes. There, on the far side of the marsh, stood a lone adult hippo, still, watchful. The air between them stretched like a taut string. The hippo made no sound, no movement beyond the gentle flick of one ear. Thomas didn't rise or speak. He simply watched. The creature's body was slightly larger than the young calf he had once freed, but it moved differently, more sure-footed, more steady. It was the gait of an animal that had once been wounded and now had grown into itself. Perhaps it was wishful thinking. Perhaps it was another adult entirely. But in his heart, he knew. The hippo blinked slowly, holding his gaze. And in that moment, Thomas felt something unshakable truth, not spoken but lived. That in a wild place, full of danger and distance, a thread had been spun between species, not by instinct or survival, but by compassion. And that thread, invisible though it was, would never break. The hippo turned, moving calmly back into the reeds. No fear, no rush, just trust. Thomas sat still for a long time after that, watching the place where it had disappeared. Then he opened Emily's drawing one more time and smiled. Sometimes, the loudest lessons come from the quietest places. In a world where fear often defines the boundary between man and beast, a single act of compassion can rewrite that line. Thomas didn't speak the hippo's language, and they didn't speak his. But trust found its way between them, not through words, but through patience, presence, and a refusal to turn away when it mattered most. It reminds us, kindness leaves a mark that even wild hearts remember. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to support more stories that celebrate the bonds we share, seen and unseen.